Good evening and welcome to CFI INSIDER. My name is Melissa Myers. I'm the National Field Organizer for Center for Inquiry and your host for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in America. We'll hear from experts in the field as featured in the latest Free Inquiry magazine. First of all, we're going to be visited and enlightened by our very own Tom Flynn, and after which we're going to bring on our guests. They're going to share their amazing history and story and narrative with you. And at the end, we're going to be able to have a little bit of discussion about why this still matters, why this matters nowadays, even though it's 100 years out. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Tom Flynn.
Hello, Melissa. It's great to be with you tonight.
Wonderful to have you.
Well, we're observing the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. It was on this date in 1920 that the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified. And then that the 70-year campaign of women to secure the right to vote was more or less satisfied. It was not a perfect situation. There were non-white women, Native American women, African American women, and others who still didn't enjoy the right to vote immediately, and some until just a few decades ago. But the tremendous work of securing the vote for women did take place at that time, and it's hugely important. Obviously, there have been a great number of commemorations of the centenary that were disrupted by the pandemic. The Center for Inquiry and the Freedom from Religion Foundation had planned to co-sponsor a conference in Washington, D.C., which had that come off, I'd be in D.C. as we speak, and I'm at home in Amherst, New York, of course. And, multiply that times 1,000. There were all sorts of arrangements for the commemoration of the centenary that were disrupted. There's still a lot of energy out there, a lot of material going on. And at the same time, there are a lot of questions. What does it mean today? To some degree, the people that we normally think of first when we think of the suffrage movement, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, people like Susan B. Anthony, they have some baggage. In some sense, they're idols with clay feet. In other senses, we simply need to understand the history in better context. And that's something we've been working toward in a lot of different areas. I've been working through the last 10 or 12 months to do a survey on our regional history site, the Freethought Trail, to mark all of the venues that were associated with the state suffrage conventions that took place in West Central New York. And that's a very key area in the national suffrage struggle, as we'll see. So that's kind of a quick introduction to where we stand. There are a lot of questions, some easy to answer, some less easy to answer. It's complex, it's nuanced, but it's fascinating. And yes, there's a lot here to celebrate tonight.
I am so excited to learn more. We are very fortunate to have, as well as yourself, Judith Wellman and Susan Goodier with us, and they have written in the most recent Free Inquiry magazine. I know that first up, Susan, who is a professor of history at SUNY Oneonta, is that right? She studies women's activism, particularly women's suffrage activism from 1840 to 1920. Earned a master's degree in gender history, a doctorate in public policy history with subfields in international gender culture and Black women's studies, and a women's studies master's degree, all from the University at Albany. So Welcome. Welcome, Susan. We're pleased to have you this evening on this amazing centennial.
Okay. So what I'd like to do, if I can, is to show you a bit of a PowerPoint presentation. And it's not going to really guide me. I just want you to have something to look at besides me. So what did we say? Slideshow. And we'll go from the beginning. So that didn't work. There it did. Okay. So what I want to talk about with you today is a little bit about the background and why women's suffrage matters. Why do we care? Why are we celebrating it? One of the things to think about is its history. So I want to start by showing you one of my very favorite images. This particular image was published by Courier and Ives. And this shows you all of the things people thought would happen if women got the right to vote. So take a look and enjoy that and see what you think as I tell you a little bit about why it's important to know this. For one thing, this particular image is from 1869, so well over 100 years ago. Women actively sought the right to vote for, it depends on where you want to count it starting, but for now 150 years, way more than 100 years. We're celebrating 100 years since some women won it. So why does that matter? Because voting is quintessentially democracy. And we purportedly live in a democracy. But when our democracy was established, that democracy ignored women, half of the population. They've always been about half of the population, sometimes 51%, and people of color. And so over time, women began to formulate these arguments that had to do with why they should be included in the polity. And so that's for that expansion of democracy has to be one of the most critical reasons for us to remember this movement of women. Now, what were women up against? And that this image doesn't have anything to do with women's suffrage. It was the only image I could find that really included everybody. Who opposed women getting the right to go vote? Pretty much everybody. Moms, dads, children, people who worked in law and politics, people who were in business, people who were social activists, all kinds of people opposed it. The women's suffrage movement, even though we're celebrating it now, even though it is something that is on, there's The Vote, there's other films that have come out, there are all kinds of stories and Zoom meetings and books. The amount of books, I'm going to need another shelf in order to accommodate all of the books that are written on the suffrage movement, many of them coming out now. You would think everybody wanted the right to vote, and that is not the case at all. In fact, there were many people, and not just men, who opposed women getting the right to vote. It really has a lot to do with custom and tradition. Women have babies. And somehow or another, because they have babies, it affects their brains. It makes them not intelligent. it makes them incapable of going to a voting poll or to participate in democracy by writing petitions or getting involved in political campaigns, in any kind of political arenas. Miles of papers and piles of books and gallons of ink were spilled in order to tell the world, and women especially, because it's not just in the United States, it's everywhere, that women were incapable of political activism or participation. And a lot of women believed that as well. So women were seen as something ugly and disgusting and brutal if they engaged in any kind of suffrage activism. Now, I want to take the time here to let you know and remind you that women's suffragists were all very different people. We can look for patterns and we can look for similarities, but many women who got involved in the movement got involved for many different reasons, as many different reasons as they had many different arguments. Some, especially white women, believed that they should get the right to vote before people, men or women of color. And so the movement, and this is one of the arguments that you'll see, one of the criticism that you'll see, and we'll talk about later, has to do with this idea that the women's suffragists weren't perfect people. And they lived in a world in the 19th and early 20th centuries that was probably even more racist than it tends to be today. So they would have kept out these women if that would have meant they would have gotten the right to vote. Now, Black women themselves were heavily engaged in suffrage activism as well, and sometimes worked with white women, especially Sojourner Truth in the center of our photograph or this slide, or in the upper, and I'm hoping that you're looking at the same thing I am, Harriet Tubman, who is in the upper right-hand corner. These two women often went to suffrage meetings and conventions and were often speakers there. Now, in the lower left is Sarah Garnett, an interesting woman because she became a principal of a school, even one of the very first Black women who did so in New York. And she founded her own suffrage movement for African-American women. Now, on the lower right side is Hester Jeffrey. She was from Rochester and not only belonged to white women's organizations, she also founded an African-American women's suffrage organization. So even in this realm, you will find sometimes there's crossover between Black and white women, and sometimes there's exclusion. Black women worked for the vote whichever way they could. We mentioned just briefly that Native American women didn't get the right to vote at the same time. I will mention, I'll take this opportunity to say that Native American women didn't become citizens. Native American people didn't become citizens of the United States until 1924, and many states prevented Native American women from voting. But in some of the later activism, the activism that came, marches on Washington, picketing the White House, some of the parades actually featured Native American women in spotlighted roles. I love political cartoons. And this one is a cartoon that indicates who was opposed to women's suffrage and this anti-suffrage movement. And you can see each of them. It's a little bit challenging because of the quality of the image. But these were businessmen. They were brewers, people, the liquor interests, and this combination was all of these people, often very wealthy women, were opposed to women getting the right to vote. One of the things that you have to keep in mind with this is that even though the brewers and the businessmen and the liquor interests opposed women's rights, they did not financially support the anti-suffrage movement. So over time, the suffrage movement changes and it becomes, towards the end of the 19th century, more acceptable, more commonplace. And by the time we get to the era of World War I, so 1914, in that time, it had become almost patriotic to vote and to be involved in voting. Although organizations like the Society of Colonial Dames were opposed to women getting the right to vote. So but suffragists jumped on any kind of publicity they could to show their support of the government, and they expected that they would have the right to vote as a result. Now, we know women did get the right to vote. It did happen when it began with a passage of an amendment through the House of Representatives. The Senate kept saying no. This didn't even happen until the war was over, just to remind you that they didn't get it because of the war and their war effort. When it finally did pass in the Senate, it has to pass in both houses. When it did, it then had to go out to the states for ratification. This image here is of Carrie Chapman. I think it's supposed to be Carrie Chapman Catt buttoning her dress, getting into the last of the states. At that time, it required 36 states in order to be able to ratify the amendment. It did happen. It actually happened in 1919. And then it was signed into law. That law went into effect in 1920. But as you know, women still haven't really made the upper echelons of political power. So there's plenty of work to do. Don't think we're done. So thank you.
Full sort of introduction to the topic and overview. I am just in love with those political cartoons, the expressions and the sort of the heaviness that is sort of displayed when it comes to everybody's sort of panic thoughts about what would happen to morality in life should we allow the women's to be voting. Absolutely wild. Some real winners. I am now pleased to reintroduce Tom, who is going to sort of connect the dots between the Freethought movement and the women's suffrage movement. Because as we know, as heathens, our perspective is oftentimes somewhat hushed up or sanitized out of the narrative. So we're very fortunate to have Tom here to sort of reconnect those pieces and parts that might have kind of gotten lost along the way. So, Tom, welcome back.
Good to be back. One of the interesting things about the suffrage movement is it's in a very dense context. Most of the early suffragists cut their teeth in the abolition movement. And a lot of what they knew about organizing, about how to stage conventions, about how to make noise, get coverage in the press, and argue for their viewpoints, they had learned from abolition activism earlier in their lives. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the suffrage activists and the free thinkers. In one way, we can look at radical reform in the 19th century in America as being defined by those three movements: abolition, at least up until the time of the Civil War, women's rights and women's suffrage, which moved on until 1920, and the Freethought movement, the organized criticism of traditional religion, which reached a high point in the late 19th century. That time is referred to as the golden age of free thought. And this is when we see Robert Greene Ingersoll, the great free thought orator who was probably heard and seen by more people than any other American prior to the advent of radio and motion pictures. He spent 4 decades crisscrossing the country, speaking in the largest theaters of the time. Sometimes he talked about politics, sometimes he talked about the arts, but his most controversial and in some quarters most popular lectures were about free thought. He carried on an avid correspondence with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I mean, there's an awful lot of overlap here. And when we look at the more radical wing of the suffrage movement, basically the suffrage movement after the Civil War sort of split in two. There was a more radical wing based in central New York State, led by people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and the least known of the three, Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Now, Gage is a fascinating figure. She comes out of Fayetteville, a little bit east of Syracuse. She's not well recognized today, and yet at the time, Anthony and Stanton and Gage were called the Triumvirate. They led the New York-based branch of the women's movement, and they co-edited the first volumes of the history of women's suffrage. Now, you've also got a somewhat more socially conservative branch of the movement based in New England, and that's led by people like Lucy Stone. The New England movement saw women's suffrage as something to be pursued state by state. The New York movement had a little more radical definition. They wanted to achieve women's suffrage by changing the Constitution. They wanted to do it nationally. And they saw it as part of a larger program of expanding the rights of women. Everything from expanding women's rights to own property, to their rights in divorce, access to shorter work weeks. The radical branch of the suffrage movement based in central New York had a much broader view. And in one sense, they were more socially dangerous if you were part of the establishment, because they wanted to change more stuff. And many of them were freethinkers. Stanton was a freethinker. Gage was a freethinker. Anthony wasn't quite. She was not religiously traditional. She was a Unitarian. She could be a little bit radical when it fit her needs, but then she could also reach out to the women's Christian temperance movement to make common cause. But Stanton and Gage were relatively radical, in Gage's case, very radical, freethinkers. And so we see this criticism of religion, which is hugely important, and it's really foundational because traditional Christianity was so anchored to the idea that women were men's property, that women were, subject to their husband's authority, on down the line, even to the whole notion of God as a white male. So the free thought component of the women's movement with lots of bumps along the way, really fought back against these things. And we saw coming out of the women's movement some really full-throated expressions of free thought, atheism, agnosticism. They weren't always accepted. They get pushed back from within the movement, but it came out. That was part of what was going on in this cauldron of reform that bubbled along in central New York throughout the 19th century.
Fantastic. That's absolutely amazing, the way that this place, this area of Western New York where we're headquartered, has been such a major sort of fulcrum point, like just area of action for this movement. And we are so extremely fortunate because we have here at our disposal, and perfect for socially distancing, the Freethought Trail right here in our own backyard, where you can actually just go, you can drive from site to site, and you can check out all of these extremely important sites to free thought. And a huge chunk of that pertains directly to women's suffrage. Thank you so much, Tom. Enlightening, as usual. Now I am turning.
Melissa, I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but you are muted.
Yeah. I was trying to figure out how to say that without.
Oh, no. Heck. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Hang on a second. Let me. I had been doing it with the shorthand and forgot to shorthand. Oops. One more time, shall we? I got a little bit of a rehearsal there. So I am very pleased to welcome Judith Wellman, who is principal investigator, historical New York research associate, and professor emerita, history department, State University of New York at Oswego. Her work focuses on historic sites relating to women's rights, the Underground Railroad, and African American life. She was the first historian at Women's Rights National Historical Park in Seneca Falls, and she's the author of The Road to Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the First Women's Rights Convention. That's by University of Illinois Press. Welcome, Judith. We're so happy to have you. Happy women's suffrage.
Thank you. It's the real day, isn't it?
It is the real.
I'm going to talk a bit about, to follow up on Tom's point, that so much of the early and most radical suffragists actually came from upstate New York. Then in the later 19th century, the headquarters of the national movement moved to New York City. So we have within New York State both the early and the later movement. And I've been working on historic sites that relate both to the Underground Railroad and African American life, and also to women's rights. And it's often very hard to find in the mid-19th century a site related to one of those that doesn't relate to both of them. And to me, these historic sites help us understand in a very visceral way the reality of this movement. And they bring home, to me at least, the fact that the movement is not simply middle-class white women in the WCTU, but that there are many women from all different walks of life, rich, poor, middling, black, white, some Native women, upstate, downstate, rural, urban, old, young. And I thought I would show you a few examples that help illustrate some of these themes. So I'm going to switch, I hope, to screen share and to the PowerPoint. It's not wanting to do it. Okay, gotcha. Can you all see this okay? All right.
Perfect.
It did seem to me that one theme of this kind of use of historic sites to illustrate otherwise often abstract themes and ideas is that it does help us make the invisible visible in a real way. And today is the very day that the 19th Amendment became part of the U.S. Constitution. It was passed by the Tennessee state legislature on August 20th, but it did not reach the desk of Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby until 100 years ago this morning. He signed it in his own private office space because he didn't want to have a lot of publicity that would pit the National Association of Women's Suffrage against the National Women's Party with Alice Paul. So it was a very quiet ceremony. It limited states, it prohibited states from limiting voting for anyone based on sex. But it did not mean that states could not continue what they'd always done after the 15th Amendment, which is to limit it with things like grandfather clauses and literacy requirements and poll taxes. So the 19th Amendment really did not enfranchise all women. And as Susan just noted, Native people were not citizens until 1924. And even after that, many Haudenosaunee people did not choose to become U.S. citizens. They are Seneca people or Onondaga people. Asian Americans did not become citizens for many years either. So it did not enfranchise everybody, but it did prohibit states from limiting the franchise based on sex. And this presentation shows a sample of historic sites that illustrate this movement, and I think bring home the reality that these are real people that make up our history and, I would argue, part of our current selves. And I think, to me, what has come through very powerfully is that they were a very diverse group. Although the movement started in Seneca Falls and was very powerful across upstate New York and what now we see as small towns, it also was extremely important and becoming increasingly so in New York City and other urban areas. And the West was actually a leader in the suffrage movement. If you look at a map, the Western states are the ones that adopt suffrage first. New York State, not until 1917, did it become the first state west of the Mississippi, actually, to endorse suffrage. It was also a cross-class movement, and it involved people both of European descent and African descent, many immigrant women, Jewish working-class women. There's a Catholic priest in Canandaigua who was a suffragist. And some of these selection of sites, and I've just picked a very few. It's difficult to pick them because there are hundreds, there are thousands. And I've been working around this idea of space-time, which comes out of physics. Physicists use it to think about the use of space with its three dimensions and then merging it into the dimension of time. So this is kind of a very abstract concept, four-dimensional, but I also find it useful for history. I don't know about you, but when I go into a historic house, like the Gage House in Fayetteville or the Anthony House in Rochester or the Stanton House in Seneca Falls, I feel almost as if I'm surrounded by the person and people who live there. And I think that these historic sites act as bridges for us across time. They allow us to become time travelers as well as stepping into a different space, helps us step back into a separate time while we obviously still remain in our own bodies here. So here are some examples of sites that illustrate some of these themes in that concept of space-time. Most of you are probably familiar with the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, and we usually think of it as the beginning of the organized women's movement. The major site that we have for that is this Wesleyan Chapel, which is in Seneca Falls and is now part of Women's Rights National Historical Park. That meeting was important because 100 people of the 300 people who were there signed a Declaration of Sentiments that was patterned after the Declaration of Independence. But instead of saying we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, they said all men and women are created equal. And then they listed a list of demands against the patriarchal establishment that they hoped would match the colonists' demands against King George. And if you read them both together, the Declaration of Sentiments is much more timely and interesting to us today because there isn't one thing they talked about that we don't also continue to deal with right now. One of the demands that they made were voting rights for women, political equality. The first 4 demands they listed, in fact, dealt with voting rights for women. And here's one of them. He's not ever permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. Because of the Declaration of Independence, of sentiments, newspapers across the country picked up the idea of women's rights. And it was rooted firmly in an American democratic natural rights tradition. So it became its strongest argument for women's rights and one of the hardest things that its opponents had to deal with as they argued against it. Women's Rights National Historical Park today includes several sites that relate to this convention. Wesleyan Chapel is here. They also own the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which is missing 2 of its major wings, but otherwise is still there and has many of her original furnishings in it. That house was given to Elizabeth Cady Stanton by her father directly. The deed says, in consideration of the love and affection which I have for my daughter. There were also other homes, including the one owned by Richard and Jane Hunt, who were Quakers, who decided to have a tea party for Lucretia Mott to host her. She was visiting from Philadelphia in her sister's home in Auburn. So Jane Hunt, who had had a baby 2 weeks before, so she was kind of sort of slow getting around, invited several people to her house. They were all Quakers, except one who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who decided that this was her chance, and she poured out the long-standing torrent of her discontent and challenged, she said, the rest of the party to do and dare anything. What they dared to do was call a convention, and they realized they'd have to have something to talk about at the convention. So on Friday morning, July 14th, Elizabeth Cady Stanton took the cars, that is the trains, to the McClintock home in Waterloo, only 4 miles away, where they drafted that Declaration of Sentiments. The Park Service also owns another historic site that they do not interpret and have not at this point restored. It's the home of Jacob Chamberlain, who was a member of Congress and also a signer of the Declaration of Sentiments, and it's kitty corner across from the Stanton House. So you really get a sense of place when you walk these sites in Seneca Falls, and it helps you to understand the ways in which the influences that were on the people who came to the convention. There are lots of sites relating to Seneca Falls that very few people know about. One of my favorites is this small house. It's right behind the Wesleyan Chapel, and it was used as the parsonage for the ministers at the chapel. And it was also used as an Underground Railroad site. So we have several examples of people escaping on the Underground Railroad who stayed there. And Peter Bannister, for example, in 1844, spoke in the chapel. And it helps us understand, as Tom was saying, the intimate and powerful connection between abolition and the Underground Railroad and the early women's rights movement. There are lots of homes of signers of the Declaration of Sentiments, and these are some of them in Seneca Falls. There are several outside the Seneca Falls village as well. And to me, they powerfully illustrate the way in which this is a cross-class movement. Joel Bunker, for example, was a cooper, and he lived next door to someone who was a blacksmith. They're working class people. Charles Hoskins was one of the richest men in town, and his house today is still a very fine federal structure. Here's another one that was only recently rediscovered. Frederick Douglass's home in Rochester. Douglass was the only known African American to sign the Declaration of Sentiments. There were 200 more people at the convention who didn't sign the Declaration, and I think there were probably several African Americans among that group. Douglass's home in Rochester burned in 1872, but he purchased this house, which his daughter lived in the 1870s, and he kept until he died. There's some suggestion that he kept it so that he would have, he lived in Washington, D.C., so people could not vote for president. D.C.'s president still cannot. So he used this house as his voting place when he had to vote. He would come back to Rochester. There are lots of churches and workplaces of signers. One of my favorites is the 1816 Farmington Quaker Meeting House, which spawned a lot of people who became Freethought people, Tom. The Seneca Falls Knitting Mill, a couple of the signers owned this mill, and at least one of the signers worked in this mill. And it's now going to be the home of the National Women's Hall of Fame. It's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous building. There are lots of convention sites, as Tom has mentioned, for the New York State Women's Suffrage Association, which held the vast majority of its annual meetings in upstate cities, all over upstate, Oswego, Niagara Falls, Ithaca, Elmira. This is one, it's now called the Jiva Theater, but it was a site of a convention for the New York State Women's Suffrage. And it's Tom has a lot of these sites on the Freethought Trail, so I didn't focus on these because it may be something you want to talk about a bit later. By the end of the century, in the early 20th century, the National Association for Women's Suffrage actually started in New York City. And then the National American Women's Suffrage Association had its headquarters in major buildings. Everybody knows these. Carnegie Hall, Cooper Union were real hot spots for women's suffrage. The 1869 meeting of the American Women's Suffrage Association was held in Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. I know about these because several of us have been working on a National Votes for Women trail. And all of these are eligible to be on that trail, but we've discovered that any building landmarked in New York City cannot be marked with a marker from the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. So these are such important sites, but they will not have a special marker funded by the Pomeroy Foundation. Upstate and downstate included sites that related both to people of color and people of European descent. One of the ones that we just got approved for a Pomeroy marker through the National Votes for Women Trail is the Ontario County Courthouse. Preston Pierce, who's the county historian, did all this work, went before the county legislature who approved it. And I'm delighted because this is the place where when Susan B. Anthony was accused of voting in 1872, which she proudly did, her trial was held here, and the outcome of the trial under Judge Ward Hunt was determined from the beginning because Judge Hunt wrote his decision before he'd heard any of the evidence, and he refused to let the jury decide the case. So it's extremely important, and it led into the Minor v. Happersett Supreme Court decision in 1875 that said states have a right to control voting requirements for people, and because you are a citizen doesn't mean you're going to be a voter. And it was important not just for the women's suffrage movement, but it was something that people trying to restrict voting for African American men then used as a model. And they said, see, Minor v. Happersett says states can do anything they want to limit voting as long as it's not based on race. So we'll go ahead, as they did with the Mississippi Constitution and others. So one of the ironies of the late 19th century and early 20th century, people called it the women's era. And it was an age in which women were becoming much more visible, much more outspoken, much more active in so many areas of life. But it's also been called the nadir of the civil rights for African American men. So African American women straddled both of those issues and had a complicated path to choose. But many of them chose to become suffragists as a way they could express their political values as women and also as African Americans. One of the sites I love the best because it's so beautiful is this 1906 Memorial African American African Methodist Episcopal, it should say Zion Church there. Sorry that I left it out. This is a photo by Susan, I think. You've got lots of photos, and I wasn't sure if I'd taken this, but I thought it was yours, Susan. And one of the people associated with that church who was so active was Hester Jeffrey, that Susan mentioned earlier. She became an agent for the National Association of Colored Women, going all around the country to set up local clubs. She seconded the resolution at their 1904 meeting in St. Louis, at which they endorsed women's suffrage and set up a department for women's suffrage. She organized the Susan B. Anthony Club in Rochester, which almost certainly was a suffrage group. And Susan B. Anthony herself gave her very last public speech a month before she died in this church. And when she died, Hester Jeffrey gave one of the eulogies to Susan B. Anthony. And she also, and then this church was built right after Anthony died, and it originally contained 4 memorial windows. One of them was to Susan B. Anthony. The first public monument anywhere in the country to Susan B. Anthony was right here. Another African-American woman who was I get tired just reading about her because she wrote like 20,000 letters. She'll just toss that off. I wrote 20,000 letters last year, and I'm thinking, I don't know how she did this. It's Mary Talbert. She was born Mary Burnett in Oberlin, Ohio, attended Oberlin College, became early on one of the first Black administrators in a high school. Married William Talbert, moved to Buffalo, lived 2 doors down from this church, and became an active, stalwart member of the church, which held a women's suffrage meeting in 1913, which included both Black women and white women. Mary Talbert became president of the Empire State Federation of Women's Clubs, which were colored women's clubs all over New York State. And then in 1916 to 1920, she became president of the National Association of Colored Women. She was a strong suffragist, and at the same time, she took on the cause of an anti-lynching campaign for the NAACP in 1921. And as Susan had mentioned, Sarah Smith Garnett lived in Brooklyn. There was a very active group of African-American women in Brooklyn who formed the Equal Suffrage League. And in the early 20th century, they met here. It's now the Carleton Nursing Home, which is why you see that sign. And we're working to get a National Votes for Women trail on the building, not as a freestanding marker where we'd have to go through New York City, but to put the marker actually on the building and with the owner's permission. So keep your fingers crossed, because that was extremely important. Another member was Verina Morton Jones, who was a doctor. Maricha Lyons, who was an educator, the first woman in the country to supervise Black and white student teachers in Weeksville. They were just a dynamite group of women, and we hardly know about them, so we're hoping to change that. One of the ones that I had never heard of, but turns out to be extremely important, was Mabel Pingwali, who was born in Canton, China, came as a young girl with her parents to New York City. Her father was a Baptist minister and had this First Chinese Baptist Church in Manhattan, which is still an ongoing organization and still there. Mabel Pingwali, at age 16, rode a horse in the 1912 New York City suffrage parade. She was a Barnard student. The irony for her is that although she worked for women's suffrage, as a Chinese-born woman, she could not vote until, some say, 1943. I've been saying the McCarran-Walter Act in 1952, but we need to check that. Seneca Falls was not out of the picture even in the early 20th century. Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, kicked off a new and much more active and dynamic phase of the suffrage movement in 1908 by bringing, on the 60th anniversary of the original convention, the National American Woman Suffrage Association back to Seneca Falls. And then in 1923, after the vote, Alice Paul said, well, now we have the vote. What should we do? We have a National Woman's Party. What should we do? She said, I took up the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments and I realized we've got the vote, but all the other issues in terms of marriage, religion, jobs, the law, personal respect, none of these do we have. And so she brought the National Woman's Party back to Seneca Falls in 1923 to introduce the Equal Rights Amendment, which, as you all know, we still do not have. I think that these historic sites give me, and I hope you also, a very powerful sense of the reality of the movement on the ground, of the numbers, the millions of people that were involved in New York State alone in this movement, and the diversity of those people. And I think by looking at these historic sites, we have one step toward getting over the kind of stereotypes that some people have looked at the suffrage movement with and realize, hey, there's a lot here that I didn't know, and that it's really exciting and that involved everyone, and that this is an American movement. And I'd like to suggest, as our earlier speakers, Tom and Susan, have both suggested, it's not over. I think the reason we're all doing this is that we now face the Voting Rights Act of 1965 looked like finally the end of this debate, but it still remains under threat, voting rights for all of us. And here are some websites that you can take a look at, and Susan and Karen Pastorella's book, I put a reference to my book. And I do urge you to look at the Freethought Trail with Tom's wonderful work at highlighting the sites where the New York State Women's Suffrage Association met also. It's absolutely beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was really fascinated by exactly how you said, the fact that we just never hear about the diversity among the participants in this movement. You may hear a little bit, you're starting to a little bit nowadays. But, when I was in school, it was all, Susan B, if you're lucky, and maybe some Elizabeth Cady Stanton, depending on where you're educated. But, we're not getting the full picture. And, I was today years old when I learned about many of these people and their impact on, certainly, as a female-bodied person, my life. I get to go exercise my rights as a result of these folks and their work and their sacrifices in many cases. For this next segment of our program this evening, I would love to hear from those of you who have been enjoying this program and learning with us tonight. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom page. So you are welcome to submit questions and we will answer them as we can. We are absolutely interested in the question, why this is still relevant today. And we've spoken a lot about that, in that we still don't, the ERA is still not ratified, right? We still have well, with the Supreme Court decision that gutted essentially the Voting Rights Act, there's so many like little odd backward steps. It's absolutely salient. So let's open it up to questions. Let's hear from our folks in the audience, and let's just sort of discuss this question a little bit. What makes it so relevant? Let's see. Do we have any questions? Okay, well, so let's see. Carolyn Brown has thanked us for our program. And wonders if there's anything that our presenters have anything to say about transgender issues when it pertains to voting rights in our modern era.
In our modern era, or historically, or both?
Well, if there's historical precedent for that, I would absolutely be fascinated to hear about it.
Well, there's a really interesting, that is just beginning to be worked on. I saw something the other day. It's not an easy topic to deal with because people weren't always leaving records about their sexuality, and especially in terms of reform and voting. But there was a woman named Dr. Mary Walker. She was one of the earliest medical doctors, graduated from a college and practiced in Rome, New York. She's from Oswego, New York. She became very, very interested in the dress reform movement, which swept a lot of suffragists in the 1852-53 era. Elizabeth Cady Stanton went to Thomas James, the barber, who was a black barber in Seneca Falls. She said she and 12 other women in Seneca Falls went and had their hair cut as part of their health reform kick. For a lot of people, it didn't last long because, as Anthony said, people look at my costume and laugh. They don't listen to what I'm saying, so I'm going to go back to the long dress. But Dr. Mary Walker went the other way, and she decided, if bloomer costumes with long skirts but pants underneath are comfortable, why not just wear men's clothes? And she did. She had a top hat and tails, and that was her dress from about the 1870s on. And she walked the streets of Oswego in that outfit, and people always wondered what her main point was. Was it just comfort and that men's clothes were easily accessible, or was she trying to say something else? I'm waiting for, there's not real evidence for it, but, historians, we use our channeling ability and our compassion and our human relations. So it'd be interesting to see someone take up that picture.
Oh, absolutely. That's completely fascinating. On that topic of new discoveries in this field, I wonder. I'm going to open this to all of our panelists. If you have favorites, what is your favorite sort of recent discovery in this field, and where are these discoveries coming from? Where do you get new history from? A lot of folks feel like history's been there. Where do we find it when it's new to us?
One of my favorite sites is in Sherwood, New York, and I'd like to hear Tom talk about that group of people who really were freethought people, and suffragists and abolitionists and Underground Railroad people and Native American advocates.
It's a fascinating area. It's a it's a small village, kind of a wide spot on the road near Aurora, New York, but tremendously vital. It was the center of a Quaker clan, the Slocums. They were very successful in business and plowed a lot of their money back into Underground Railroad-related projects. They were strong abolitionists.
The Howlands.
And their descendants, their daughters and their granddaughters, several of them became enormously important in the suffrage movement. And so in what used to be called Sherwood, it's now near Aurora, New York, as I mentioned, there's the entire village is, I believe, on the National Register of Historic Places. It's more than 100 buildings. There's a fascinating museum, the Howland Stone Store, which was the patriarch Slocum's original business. It's a beautiful, beautiful round stone building of the sort that you see so many of in the area, and it's got some really, really fascinating Underground Railroad and a lot of suffrage memorabilia, posters, ephemera. It's one of the better suffrage museums in the region. And as you get into it, and I know we have a question about the Freethought Trail. It's at freethought-trail.org. I know someone asked, what would you suggest as a way to get started on a visit? And we have it organized by cause. If you want to look up women's suffrage, we have a historical summary on all the sites. If there's an area that's near you or you'd like to visit, you can look at that area. And Sherwood's a great place to start, in part because there wasn't a lot of economic dynamism there later on. A lot of the buildings are still there, and you can still get a vivid sense of what life in that village must have been. And you can look it up on the Freethought Trail site, go to locations, click Sherwood. There's links there to the personalities. Isabel Howland was a very important person, held a lot of administrative posts in the New York State Women's Suffrage Association, was a major donor to the movement. And just, the interconnections. You find an abolitionist, there's links to the suffrage movement. One just quick example, Garrett Smith, multi-millionaire, very important businessman, real estate speculator, based in a little village called Peterborough, which his father had founded. And Smith gave to all sorts of radical reform movements at the time, was a principal financier of the abolition movement, was one of the so-called Secret Six, six wealthy Northerners who kept their heads down, but funded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Larger-than-life character, had an enormous influence on the abolition movement. Guess who one of his cousins was? Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who met her future husband at a party at Garrett Smith's mansion in Peterborough. The connections, it's like unweaving a scarf. Everywhere you look, there's a new connection. And here are dress reformers, and here are radical utopians, here are free thinkers, here are abolitionists, here are suffragists, and many of them are the same people, or, it's all like Kevin Bacon. Everybody's connected.
Truly. Do you suppose that there's something in the area, something about the culture of the area that would sort of facilitate the growth of these ideas, the growth of these movements? What is it about Western New York?
It was in the water, specifically the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal in the mid-19th century was the principal road westward. Huge numbers of people from all different walks of life were all packed cheek by jowl in the packet boats. They met people, they made connections that they never would have met. They tried new things. It was just coming west on the packet boats. It was an inherently liberating activity, and it loosened up a lot of thinking and made a lot of room for social innovation. So yes, suffrage, freethought, new religions. The Seventh-day Adventists came out of this area. The Mormon Church came out of this area. I mean, West Central New York served America in the 19th century in exactly the same way that Southern California served it in the 20th. It was the cauldron of reform and radical experimentation. And yes, that's why we've got so many radical reform sites here. And certainly when you're looking at suffrage, even to treat the subject from a national perspective, New York is really, really important. Because of this social ferment, and also because New York was the most populous state at the time, was a much larger percentage of the national life than it is today. And it was a very happening place, and lots of reform in it.
Smashing. Let's see. Do we have any other questions from our audience? Anybody who has something that's just been burning them up inside, now's your chance. In the meantime, I have a question, and that is regarding the timing of this movement, or the passage of suffrage, kind of coincidentally with our last major pandemic. I'm interested about, since pandemic is what we all have on the brain lately, I'm interested in what, if at all, what effect that might have had on the movement, on the signing, on the passage, etc.
I'm not entirely sure. I think we have to look at this in perspective. I mean, the 1918 pandemic had a much larger death toll than so far the coronavirus epidemic has had. But this was a time when public health was much dicier. People would die of diphtheria, people would die of whooping cough, what have you. So relative to the death toll, I think the early 20th century pandemic was somewhat less disturbing, somewhat less tragic, because deaths of communicable diseases generally were much higher. It wasn't as unusual. Today, people think, oh, medicine has cured everything, and along comes the coronavirus, and we have no defenses against it, and it's petrifying. Early 20th century life was full of diseases against which we had very few defenses. So the so-called Spanish flu was a big one, but on one level, it was just one more. So I think possibly the effect of America's participation in World War I may have had a little more influence in terms of maybe knocking some things loose and making radical change more possible at that moment. Mm-hmm. I will happily defer to our two real historians. I'm just an armchair historian. I have to hold armchair.
I could say the estimate that's given, and I find this so hard to believe, is 675,000 Americans died of that flu. It's just overwhelming. Wow. Carrie Chapman Catt had it. She obviously didn't die of it. Mm-hmm. And I did find that somewhere a reference to a woman was writing a letter. She said, everyone who doesn't have the flu has gone to vote today. So it's hard. We need to explore that more, because it's so ironic that it's the same pattern.
Right. Yeah. That's history for you. It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Isn't that the saying?
Yes.
All right. Folks, do you have any other questions for our incredible experts?
I see one from Steve Bradding.
Yes.
Did you see that?
Yeah. So Steve is asking, what if the free thinkers in the suffrage movement have a particular effect on the overall movement?
I can talk about it, but you
go for it. Absolutely.
I think the Freethought movement, in a way, is a similar result from the breakup of especially formerly Calvinist Presbyterian Congregationalists, and it split apart and created so many, the spiritualist movement and Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science movement. And for people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, they really studied the Bible. They were at the forefront of these, the movement in the late 19th century to begin looking at the Bible as a document and try to document it historically. And Stanton and Gage both ended up, with Stanton's name as editor, writing the Women's Bible, which was picking out pieces in the Bible that related to women, then talking about them. And Gage herself became really a powerful leader and newspaper editor for Freethought, and broke away from the movement that Anthony was leading more, as Tom said, to the WC, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which wasn't at all appealing to lots of people. And I think, Tom, didn't that place in Sherwood that was the tavern William Howland bought it, and it's his house. It's now being restored as Open Door, but he called it the Ingersoll Center, or
it's called the Bob Ingersoll House.
right.
It was serving as a hotel and a public house at that point, and he just named it after Ingersoll in tribute. And then later, another owner changed it back to the Sherwood Hotel. But yes, it was named the Bob Ingersoll House in tribute to Ingersoll, who was this immense figure in the Freethought movement. You know, I think one of the fascinating intersections of Freethought and the suffrage movement has to do with exclusion. In 1898, Elizabeth Cady Stanton published the first volume of the Woman's Bible, which she'd edited. It was a very controversial book. There were a lot of people in the movement, including Susan B. Anthony, who really didn't think that a high-profile book attacking traditional Christianity was the most politic thing to do. And Stanton found herself pretty much drummed out of the movement. And after the turn of the 20th century and until her death, she couldn't get published in suffrage publications anymore. And she wrote columns in a couple of Freethought magazines because that was the only place that she could find a home. And at our research library at the Center for Inquiry in Amherst, we have some of these magazines. We've had a couple of occasions where women's studies students from the University of Buffalo have come over and seen these things and said, wow, so this is what Stanton was doing the last years of her life. We never knew. And it turned out there was a lot of this material that had not made it into the principal bibliographies of Stanton.
Yeah, that's right.
Matilda Jocelyn Gage had an even harder time. She'd been radical. She'd been out as a freethinker since the beginning. And Anthony and some others pretty much kind of edged her out of the movement circa 1890. And she confined her activism to Freethought, wrote a very influential book, Woman, Church, and State. But the funny thing is, at the mid-20th century, when people talked about suffrage, they only thought about Anthony. Stanton had been pretty much buried from the historical record. Gage had been entirely buried, largely because of their Freethought activism. Now, the second wave feminist scholars in the 60s rehabilitated Stanton. And then we went through several decades where, it was Anthony and Stanton, and they were everything. And, of course, that wasn't true either. There were these African-American activists. There were lots of people who didn't get to cast a big shadow in the history of the movement as, frankly, Anthony and Stanton had shaped it so profoundly. And it really wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that Gage started to be rediscovered. She'd been buried so deeply that it was really the scholarship of Sally Resch Wagner, who is now director of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Center in Fayetteville at Gage's house, who has brought Gage back to the fore. So it's kind of ironic. Every time I go to the Women's Rights National Historic Park in Seneca Falls, in the gift shop, invariably, they have the Women's Bible, which is the book that got Stanton chased out of the movement. And they have Woman, Church, and State, which is the book that made sure that the movement washed its hands of Gage. And now it's all drawn back together.
So,
and it's all on the Freethought Trail. Visit and check it out.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
And so, Melissa, I wanted to kind of tie in some of what Thomas said with the question you asked, I don't know, ages ago, but you asked, well, so history's been done, right? So yeah. What's new? What's different? And some of the points that Judy's making and that Tom is making that connect with that question is that new information comes to light because new people are doing research. When diversity is kind of a thread that's been going through what we've been talking about. What makes New York so important? It's diversity, from immigration African Americans, Native Americans. This land, we in New York are on Haudenosaunee land. And the women of the Haudenosaunee were extremely influential to the women, white women of the women's suffrage, women's rights, and women's suffrage movement. So the diversity is critical. And then you add another layer of diversity and understanding the movement itself. And then you get new and more diverse people going to college. We are democratizing our educational system, making it available to different kinds of people. And they look with different eyes. They see things differently. And they ask different questions. So it enriches the historiography. Now, on top of that, I would add one more major point, maybe two. But there is the fact that technology is giving us scanned documents. We no longer, as scholars and historians, we can do a lot of our research on the computers with scanned documents. Newspapers are being scanned every single day. There are projects going on. Ontario, they're in Ontario County, they're doing that extremely interesting project where they've scanned all of their, maybe all, a lot of their local newspapers. Then they become keyword searchable. So you bring in these new, unique scholars looking at new and different topics with access through the internet and these scanned documents. And then there's one more important thing, and that is that as the news gets out, as this information gets out, as we talk about this, people out in our audience or in the areas that know the people in the audience, they think, gee, does my great-grandmother, I think, was interested. And then they realize that those papers that belong to that family member are important. And then hopefully, I hope they would give them to an archive, and then they become available. And we get, and because there's still many, many papers in private collections, but people need to know how important they are to our understanding, not just of the past, but of the present.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Like the democratization of information and the just sort of greater availability of higher education to broader groups of folks has absolutely been a boon in, intellectual circles. And that's a great point that, every single time we are diversifying the circle of research and diversifying the researchers, we are absolutely lending perspective to every single pursuit that, comes with a research aspect. And that's a stellar point. I love that, because I think that a lot of us who don't, sit around and think about history constantly, although I do, a lot of us kind of just go, yeah, surely it's done, right? History is over by now. We do have a couple more questions from our crowd this evening. So I'm going to look at Lori's question. She would like to know about the percentage of women who voted right after the amendment passed, and how's that changed over the years? What was participation like to begin with? Are we better at it now?
Susan, do you know? I really don't.
Well, First of all, the question is hard to answer.
Yeah.
Because nobody kept the statistics. Nobody said how many people are voting and how many of those people who are voting are women. So we don't know that. There's been some work done on after suffrage. There's a lot of speculation, but we don't actually know that. What we do know is that it took longer than people, well, a couple of things. One thing, it took longer than a lot of people realize for those customs that I mentioned at the beginning of this program to take effect. So the daughter of Nicholas Butler, who was the president of Columbia University, Sarah, went on a trip around New York State into the upper areas of New York State, knocking on doors and saying, I want to know, hey, did you vote? Have you voted? Are you going to vote? What are your feelings about voting? And many of these women said, my husband won't let me. Well, I didn't really think about it. Well, I don't know how to vote. There's so many barriers, many of which we hear echoed even today, of access to voting. Voting, even though women had the right to vote, according to the law, according to the Constitution, still requires a changing of thinking, a changing of patterns of behavior. And so that's part of it. But I also want to make the point, which I think is fascinating, is that every anti-suffrage woman that I was able to study, and I studied about that topic in New York State, every single woman registered, an anti-suffrage woman went out, registered to vote, and voted. In fact, they put it in their obituary. Well, before she died, she registered and went to the polls, and she voted for temperance or whatever. So, and that shocks people, but anti-suffragists were very dutiful, and they believed that if the government told them to do something, no matter what, that's what they would do. So it does take, and there are many people who say, and that's the other kind of caveat to this, there are many people who believe, even today, that their vote doesn't matter. And that's not a new idea, but it certainly is one we've got to get rid of, because these women and men worked for 3 generations, worked their fingers to the bones to expand democracy so that women could have, that half the population could have the right to vote. And we still need to honor that work that they did, that made it possible for women today to vote. And we need to expand it in so that every single person has that ability.
Truly, that persistent myth of our vote doesn't count. Oh, the electoral college gets in the way. Apportionment, like all these things.
Well, they do.
we do. We do. We have all of these. We do have all of these sort of mechanisms that governments have placed in between people and their votes. That is, we continue to see it as, some of our commenters have mentioned with the post office. We're in the midst of a pandemic and trying to make sure that we have just the technology to go ahead and process all of those votes. This does continue to be salient, I would like to, I think we have time for probably one more question.
I'd like to hear Jason's discussed. Jason Marcus.
Jason's? Sure.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Okay. So Jason says, thank you for this presentation and for preserving this important history. Thanks for noting the role of women of color in this movement. The fact that they weren't included in those initial suffragette victories, in light of the fact that women of color still faced unjust hurdles to democratic participation in the new Jim Crow era. How do our panelists justify agreeing to participate on a panel without any Black?
So can I answer that? Or can I
Go
begin to answer?
Please.
Judy, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, sometimes that happens, and it's not something that was a deliberate intention. It wasn't something that people said, oh, well, we're going to have a panel and we're going to talk about Black people, but we're not going to include Black people. You don't need to be a Black person to be able to talk about what Black people went through. Nor do you need to be a man to talk about the troubles that men have faced historically, or a woman in order to talk about women's issues. That's kind of identity history. And one of the things I say to my students, and I teach about Black women, I teach about Native American women. I'm not either. But I teach always about dead people. And I'm not dead either. So it's something where when you are trained and you focus and you work and you read and you listen and you study, and that's what you do, you have skills that go beyond your own identity. And that's what you're supposed to do as scholars, as historians, as legitimate citizens of this country and then of this world. So, good question.
Yeah, absolutely.
My sense as I was reading it, you're absolutely right, Susan. But we're also in a period I think you made the point that history as it's written changes because have more people writing it from different perspectives. And I guess my immediate reaction was, at least I personally am in transition. And I realize, most of the historians I've dealt with in the past have been people of European descent, which doesn't mean they're anything like me at all. It took me a long time to realize that, and it's the same thing with a person of color. Not everybody's going to be thinking the same way, but I just made it a commitment. I think a lot of us are working toward that, to realize, hey, maybe because this is a white group, maybe we just never invited any Black women to join this group. And maybe we've never put as a focus on our next, I'm thinking of the Women's Rights Alliance of New York State, which is we're having a virtual conference July 31st. Please come. It's on suffragists of color in New York State. And I think everyone on the panel is a Black person, except for one, or a Native person. And I think that's part of our own learning. So that's why I was glad that you asked that question, Jason. We're all growing and becoming more aware. And thank you. Yes.
No, I am happy that we got a chance to speak to that. Tom, did you want to add anything to that?
Just wanted to riff off of that in one sense. I think one of the reasons why the Suffrage Centennial is so very much worth celebrating is that what the suffragists achieved in their roughly 7 decades of effort proved to be so robust. Yes, on this date in 1920, women had the vote, but lots of white women couldn't vote. Native American women couldn't vote. Black women couldn't vote. Asian women couldn't vote. But as the decades moved forward, each of those groups received the franchise. And the thing that just strikes me so much about that is as African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, as all of these excluded groups got the vote, the suffragists had done their work so well that you never heard anyone saying, oh, well, now Native American men can vote. Oh, now Asian American men, African American men can vote. After 1920, you just didn't hear serious discussion about restricting the franchise to males. The suffrage movement had put a nail in that, at least until the Republican convention last night, but I digress.
Right. All right.
It's an enormous achievement. We can acknowledge the baggage, we can acknowledge the feet of clay. It's still something to celebrate.
Absolutely is. And I plan on celebrating by voting. And I am registered to vote in my state, which is New York State. If you are not yet registered to vote in your home state, you can check online. There, you just pop into Brother Google there. The last state I registered to vote in my state. And in order to vote in this upcoming election, and away you go. In some states, you're going to have to check individual rules and regulations, but in some cases, you may be able to register the day of. I know that's the case in my home state, California. So, my friends, I really, really implore you to exercise that franchise that was so hard fought and hard earned, regardless of your gender orientation. It's extremely important, and I highly encourage you to take part. Go ahead and throw in your vote for all the tough old birds who couldn't vote before 1920. My guests, I give you my deepest thanks. Thank you very much for joining us on this, our second endeavor for Center for Inquiry Insider. I want to thank Tom and Judith, Susan. This has been terrific. I've enjoyed learning with you. I will send out an email after this program you're all going to get, just to sort of follow up. We hope that you look into the Center for Inquiry a little bit more fully. If you're new to us, we welcome you. Check us out at centerforinquiry.org. Next month, we will be joined by Bertha Vasquez, who is in charge of our TIES program, and she helps bring resources to teachers who are endeavoring to teach evolution accurately across the nation. That's on Tuesday, September 29th at 7 o'clock, and you can register for that at centerforinquiry.org/insider. And we hope to see you there. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. We know that you have many places to spend your time, and we are very glad you chose to do it with us. So thank you, and have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Melissa, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Susan.
Good night. Good night. Thank you. Good to see you, Tom, Judy. Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.